Welcome to this beginner's course in Excel. I'm really excited that you decided to join me in this course. In this first video, I will teach you the fundamentals of Excel, and I will show you some tips and tricks on how you can use Excel as an efficient tool. In the next 4 videos, we are going to do 10 exercises. I believe the best way to learn Excel is to do exercises. So I recommend that you download the exercises before you watch the next videos. If you have any questions during the course, please contact me by writing a comment under the videos or by sending me an email. I hope you enjoy this course. Let's get started. When you first open Microsoft Excel, there's a lot of things that you need to be aware of. So let's go through some of the basics. First off, when you first open Microsoft Excel, you're presented with a worksheet. A worksheet contains cells. And so now you see me clicking on a few of these cells. There are columns in a worksheet. Those go along the top. And there are rows. Let's talk a little bit about the columns. You see the columns are labeled with letters, A, B, C, D, and so on. This goes on for quite some time. In fact, if I go over to the right, you'll see that this goes on for quite a few columns. In fact, there are hundreds and thousands of possible columns that you can include. Now let's go back to the column A. Same thing goes for rows. If I go down the rows, you see that they're labeled with numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on. As I scroll down, you'll see that there are hundreds, if not thousands of rows. In fact, you can even have 1,000,000 rows. So you can deal with some pretty big data sets in Microsoft Excel. Now, columns and rows combine together to give us cell references. So let me just click on a cell. So you see here, I just arbitrarily clicked on a cell, and this cell, just like any other cell, has a reference. This particular cell is in column D, row 7. So we say that this cell's reference is D7. The same goes for any other cell on the worksheet. In addition to worksheet, a workbook, which is what you have when you open up Microsoft Excel, can contain multiple worksheets. So, since we're looking at one worksheet now, let's look at another one. At the bottom left-hand corner, you see that when you open up Microsoft Excel, there can be multiple worksheets. We are in sheet 1 at the moment. If we click on sheet 2, we'll go to a new sheet. That's something we're going to get to later. But you can add new sheets and subtract sheets at your will. The way you add a sheet is by clicking the plus sign here. And you see I got a new sheet, sheet 3. And I can move that sheet around wherever I wish. And I can double click on it and give it a new name. I could also get rid of the sheet if I don't want it by right-clicking on it and saying delete. And now I'm back to the original 2 sheets I started with. Next, let's learn how to insert text, numbers, and formulas into the cells. So let's click on some arbitrary cell and first remember how the references work. So I click here, I'm in cell H5 because I'm in column H, row 5. Now let me start inserting some text. So let's put some names of people I know. Inputting text is as simple as clicking in a cell and starting to type. Now, you can do this in 2 ways. When you click on a cell, you can directly type into the cell as you saw I just did. If you want to try the alternative way, you click on a cell, and then instead of typing directly, you can go up here into what's called the formula bar. And you can type your text, numbers, or formulas in here. And hit enter, and the text is in the cell. Also, notice that if I click in a cell, I can tell the cell reference both by noticing the column and the row, and by looking at the top left corner here, I'm in the name box. I get the cell reference. So this cell is H5, as we learned earlier. I can also delete the contents of a cell quite easily by clicking on the cell one time and hitting the delete key, not the backspace key. I can also insert numbers into cell in much the same way. So next to this cell, in cell I5, let's type in some numbers. It's as simple as typing them in directly into the cell or through the formula bar. Finally, let's learn how to adjust the width of a column, and then we'll move on to formulas. So, as you can see, there's a lot of empty space here in this cell. If I don't like to see that empty space, I can change the width of the cell by simply going up to the cell. To the right of that cell column, I can grab this edge and pull it to make it narrower or wider as I wish. I can also double click and the cell will automatically fit to all the contents in the column. Now let's see what formulas look like in Excel. Sometimes it's interesting to not just input numbers and words, but to calculate some formula using those numbers. So let's say that I want to add up these numbers. So this will be a brief introduction to what formulas look like in Excel. Now, of course, I can pull out my calculator and add these numbers up, but it turns out Excel is quite a powerful calculator itself. So I choose the cell where I want the sum to be located, maybe directly below, and then I go up to this section on the top right corner, and I click on this arrow and choose Sum. Excel automatically suggests a group of cells that I would like to sum. If that's correct, which it is, I can just hit enter here, and I get the sum of these 4 cells. Now I can also do that in any cell, not directly below. I can go to the right, for example, and I can go over here to auto sum, choose sum, and you see here it's suggesting that I'm just summing this number. Sometimes it does a good job, as you saw, and sometimes it's not what you want. So if you want to adjust what it suggested, you simply need to re-highlight the range that you're interested in. So I want these 4 numbers summed, so instead of hitting enter, I re-highlight what I'm interested and then hit enter. And I get the same exact result, which is 205. Now, a good tool when you're working in Excel is oftentimes you'll make a mistake and you'll want to undo that mistake. In the top left-hand corner, there are 2 arrows, curvy looking arrows. One of them is undo and the other is redo. So you can go back and forward, undoing mistakes and redoing them if you want to go forward again. So let's pretend the last thing that I did was a mistake and I want it to go away. I can delete it, but I can also undo. So let's click undo. And you see my formula for summing the cells disappears. I can redo it as well. Let's learn some basic arithmetic in Excel. So, on your keyboard, you're going to find a few symbols, and they are quite what you would expect them to be. The plus sign, the minus sign, Multiplication is the asterisk or star symbol on the keyboard, and division is the /. Let's actually use these to do some basic arithmetic. So let's click on a cell directly to the right of plus, and let's add two numbers. Whenever you want to do a formula in Excel, you need to start with the equal sign. So let's add 2 plus 2. So you can use Excel as a very simple calculator. Let's subtract 2 from 2. Let's multiply 2 times 2. You see I didn't start with the equal sign. And if you don't start with the equal sign, Excel will interpret this as some form of text. So let's correct that. Now it gets interpreted as a formula and it gets calculated. 2 divided by 2. As we see, these are simple arithmetic, but Excel is capable of much more as well. But let's start with the basics. Now, in addition to the way that we just calculated these numbers, we could have also used cell references in our formula instead of typing in the numbers 2 plus 2. For example, let's put the number 2 and 5 in these two cells. Now, if I want the sum of these two cells, I know already that I can do 2 plus 5. But can I use cell references to get the same result? Let's see. Equals. Now, instead of typing 2, I'm going to click on the cell that contains 2, then use the plus sign. Then instead of clicking 5, I'm going to click on the cell that contains 5. And I get the same result. And the same goes for all other forms of arithmetic. So let's do some multiplication as well. So let's say I want to multiply 2 times 5. Of course we know that equals 10. But let's use cell references. Equals 2 times 5. 10. Perfect. Let me say a word now about formatting. So sometimes you want to format your cells to represent currency, sometimes percentages, sometimes you want to show numbers with commas and decimal places. So turns out you have complete control. So click on the cell that you want to change the format of. Let's say this is a $50. So if I want the dollar sign, I click on the cell, and as you can see, I can choose various currencies here: euro, dollars, pounds, etc. And if I get this symbol, so this is 2 lessons in one, this just indicates that what I am looking at here can't fit in the cell, so I need to adjust the column width. There we go. Not only do you see that if a cell is too small for its context to be viewed, you get the number sign, but you also see that we changed the format of this cell from just a plain old number to a currency, specifically dollars. Let's change the guy below to be euros. Now, if we don't need the decimal places, we can also adjust those. So you can do these individually, and you can do these things simultaneously. So if I want to do them simultaneously, I can highlight these two, and then I go over here, and you see one of these increases the number of decimal places, and one decreases. And I decrease them as I see fit. In addition to currencies, sometimes you're dealing with percentages. So let's say we're dealing with 25%. And I want this to be formatted as a percentage and not as a decimal format. So I click on the cell, and in the same group of operations here, I click on percentage. And now I have myself percentage. And I can increase and decrease the decimals as I see fit. One final word about formatting. Let's say we're dealing with a very big number. Let me make up a big number in cell I2. A very messy number. In fact, if it's very big, sometimes Excel automatically decides to use scientific notation. If you don't like scientific notation and you want to see this number, you can make the cell a little wider, and then you're seeing it in its raw form. But still, wouldn't you agree that that's difficult to interpret? I would much rather have commas in the appropriate places. So I click on the cell, and there is an option in the same group with a comma. I click on comma. I have a problem which I faced before, which now I know means I need to make my cell wider. It's too small to contain the number. So I make it wider and wider, and here I see that this was actually a giant number, 2,565,849,735, and 0 decimal places. I don't need those. Let me say another word about functions and formulas. As you saw earlier, we used the sum function, and then we did some basic arithmetic as well. Turns out there are tons and tons of more functions and formulas in Excel. Let me show you where you can start to find some of them. The first group are the most often used formulas, and they're in the home ribbon in the same group that we saw earlier, the auto sum group. So if we click on the arrow, we see that there is a sum function, average, count, max, and min. These tend to be used so often that Excel has decided to put them front and center so you can access them very quickly. But it turns out there are a lot more functions, and one way to see some of them is to click on the formulas ribbon, and then you see all these functions. There's the group that we just looked at, but in addition to that, there are grouped financial functions, logical functions, text, date and time, lookup and reference, math, and then some additional functions for more specific tasks. So if there's something that you're thinking of doing in Excel, it turns out that there's probably a formula already ready for you to use. All right, I think we did enough on this sheet. Let's go to the second sheet that you saw earlier, where we can continue developing some of our fundamental Excel skills. So I'm going to click on sheet 2. And as you can see on sheet 2, I've prepared some data for us to play around with. So what are we looking at here? Very quickly, we're looking at some students, and we're looking at their test scores. And I see I have a column here which is empty, which is called average, as well as the lowest average and highest average scores. Let's work on this data first, and then we'll move on to this second data set. So let's get the average test score for all of these students. It turns out there are 7 of them. So how do I do this? Well, first off, I've decided I want to put the average for Barbara over here in cell F3. It's appropriate. How can I do this? Well, I'll go back to the home ribbon, and I'll go back to where I did the sum function, and I see that there's an average function. I click on the average function. Excel suggests the 3 numbers to the left, and those are the numbers I want to average. So I simply hit enter, and we see that Barbara's average test score was a 46. Not so great, is it? I want to do the same thing for Jennifer, Robert, James, all the way down to Linda, but I don't want to have to repeat that process each time. So how can I use some of Excel's capabilities to make my life easier? Well, first I did it for Barbara. I have to do that. But when I'm done with that, if I want to repeat that same formula for all the rest of the rows, I simply go to the bottom right-hand corner of the cell, and I get this black plus sign. Once I have that black plus sign, I click and I hold, and then I drag. I drag down until I'm satisfied, and then I stop. This is called autofilling. And what it does, as you can see, is it calculated the average score for each of the students. It basically repeated the same formula that I did for Barbara for the rest of the students. So that's a great time saver. Let's also get the average test score for each of the tests. That might be interesting. This time, I'll put it under each test. So I'll click on the cell, then I'll go over to auto sum, click average. Excel suggests all the numbers above, which is appropriate, so I hit enter. And I see the average score for test 1 was 50. Again, I don't need to repeat this for test 2 and 3. I simply can grab the bottom right hand corner and drag it to the right, just like I dragged down earlier. I can autofill to the left and to the right. Okay, great. That was really quick. If I wanted to get those averages with a calculator, it would have definitely taken me a lot longer than that. Let's also go ahead and get the average of all the scores for the students. Let's drag this cell one more to the right. And this 51.5 to me indicates that the average of the averages was 51.5. Okay, what do I have here? I want to get the lowest average test score and the highest average test score. Here are the test scores. So it turns out there's a function that will get both of these for us. So the lowest or the minimum, you might have seen this earlier, is in the same group, minimum. Except this time, Excel's suggesting the wrong numbers. I need to give it the numbers I want it to find the minimum of. So I highlight the average test scores of the students. And I see the minimum test score was in fact 33, which was James. For the max, it's very similar. I click in the cell and I go over to max. This time, Excel's not suggesting the right thing again, so I need to highlight the appropriate numbers. And I know already, just from looking at these numbers, that the maximum is going to be 69. Let's see if the function works properly. And in fact, it does. Before we go on to the next data set, let's also learn how to make charts in Excel. So, a real basic introduction to making charts. The quickest way to make a chart is if you can highlight the cells where you want to make the chart out of. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this group of cells. A group of cells sometimes is called a range or an array. I go over to the Insert ribbon, and then I go over to Charts, and I see that I have a lot of choices. So I think an appropriate chart here may be a bar chart. So I click on the bar chart group, and I see I have a few choices. I hover over these and I get some previews. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just take a 2D column chart. I can drag the chart and put it wherever I would like. I can make it bigger or smaller by grabbing the corner. I can rename the title of the chart by clicking on it and saying whatever I want it to say. Start typing. And then I can play around with a little bit of formatting by using some of these presets over here. So you see some of these are really pretty looking. So let's just choose one. I like this one. Very edgy. And maybe instead of test chart, let's call this test scores. Okay, so that's how you make a chart. It's as quick as that. You can make a very pretty column chart by simply highlighting the range and then playing around a little bit with the chart styles, retitling, and you got yourself a very informative and pretty chart. Okay, now we're ready to move to this next data set here. So let me scroll down a bit and zoom in a bit. By the way, you could zoom in and out in the bottom left-hand corner. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the exchange rate of US dollars to euros. I have 300 US dollars in this cell, and I want to convert that to euros. So I know that if I had a calculator, I can multiply how many dollars I have by the exchange rate to euros, and I would get how many euros I have. Let's put that over here. Remember, formulas start with equal sign. Then I want to multiply this cell by this cell. And I see that 300 US dollars will give me 264 euros. I can do the same thing for each of the remaining cells, except there's going to be one problem. If I drag the formula down and I use the autofill skill that we learned a moment ago, let's see what happens. It looks like I'm getting unusual results. Something must be going wrong. Let's investigate. By clicking on the cell, I can look at the formula bar and I can see what's being done. In fact, I can even click in the formula bar and Excel will highlight the cells that are involved in the formula. And this helps me a lot in seeing what went wrong. So look what happened here. When I used autofill and I dragged the initial formula I created down to the next cell, both the exchange rate reference and the dollar reference also moved down. They moved down because they are called relative references. Relative references move when you drag them up and down, left and right. Sometimes you want that to be the case. Sometimes you don't want the reference to change. In this case, you can reason that we wanted the reference to change from 300 to 250 for this cell, but we didn't want this cell reference to move. So how can we fix that? Well, turns out there's a form of referencing called absolute referencing, and that will actually cement the reference so it doesn't change when you use autofill and you drag a formula. So let's correct this and see if it works. Let's delete the contents of all these cells. Let's go back to our original formula. Let's delete it and let's start from scratch. Equals this cell times this cell. That's exactly what we did, and that is not incorrect. However, if I intend to drag this formula down, I know what's going to happen. So I want this cell to be an absolute reference and not move. So the way I do that is I go in the formula bar and I make sure that it's this correct cell I want to make absolute. So I click on it and then I hit the F4 key on my keyboard, and what Excel does is it puts dollar signs, as you can see, around the letter of the column and the number of the row. That is an absolute cell reference. Let's see what happens. 264, exactly what we got before. But let's now drag down and see what happens. Oh, these look like reasonable results. Let's click on the last one and see exactly what happened. As we can see, when we drag the formula down, the row changed for this cell reference, but the exchange rate stayed the same because we used absolute cell references. So sometimes relative cell references are appropriate, and sometimes absolute cell references are important. Make sure you think through and determine which is appropriate. Let's conclude this initial video by going through some other autofill capabilities in Excel. So, turns out there's some convenient ways of using autofill so you don't have to type a lot. So, let's say you're working with data where you're dealing with the day of the week. So you type the first day, Monday, and then you want to type Tuesday. It turns out you don't need to keep typing this. Just type Monday, and in the same way that you used autofill for the formulas above, grab the bottom right hand corner and drag to the right, and you'll see a preview. Excel recognizes the word Monday and knows it's the day of the week, and if you drag it to the right, will fill the rest of the days of the week. Turns out we can do this with months as well. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. That saves us a lot of time. You can also do this with numbers. 1, I want number 2 in the second cell. So I can use autofill. I can grab the bottom right hand corner. This time though, I have to hold the control key while I drag, and Excel will increment up by 1 up to the point where I'm interested, and if I stop here, of course, I'll get 12. How about if you want to increment by some other number? So let's say we want to go 2, 4, 6, 8. Well, there you have to train Excel a bit. If you start at 2 and you drag, it's going to go 3 next. So you don't want that. What you need to do is give it the second number and then highlight both of these. Then begin autofilling by grabbing the bottom right hand corner, and Excel will automatically recognize that you're going up by 2 and will autofill the rest of the cells until you stop in increments of 2. Finally, you could use this with some arbitrary names as well. Let's say you have a few teams that you're working on. Team 1. Instead of typing Team 2, Team 3, Team 4, I can simply drag and Excel will recognize this and autofill the team number. Everything we did here, you could also have done along the columns as well. So, for example, Team 1, if I don't want to go left and right, I can go down. And Excel will autofill going down as well. So you can use autofill with formulas and in other ways by dragging to the right, to the left, up or down. Usually down and to the right. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something useful. In the next video, we're going to go through some exercises. Again, I recommend that you download the worksheet first and then try to do the exercises first. The best way to learn Excel is by doing. See you tomorrow.